To the Rethinking Economics 21. We're so excited to have you here. We've got loads of great things lined up, and thanks for joining us here today at the opening plenary with Jayati Ghosh. Rethinking Economics is a network of about 120 groups in over 30 countries. All of our groups are working towards changing economics education in the classroom and society. If you want to tweet or post about this festival, the hashtag we'll be using is Rethink21. If you are joining us here on YouTube, or if you would prefer to watch this on YouTube, you can find it at our YouTube channel, Rethinking Economics. There will be closed captioning options there as well. So if your first language isn't English and you would find that easier, please do head over to our YouTube channel. If you're joining us here on Remo, and I'd be thrilled if you are, then do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A once the presentation with Jayati starts. But also after the event and before the event, you'll be joining tables when we're outside of this presentation mode, and you can speak to people on your table, turn your mic on, turn your video on, or you can send messages in the chat. So we would really encourage you to do that in between each of the sessions. This year, what we tried to do with this festival is focus on some key principles. Pluralism, bringing together lots of different ideas within economics, ideas which often aren't considered within academia and education. Interdisciplinary thinking. So what we want to do is we want to reach out to other disciplines and broaden the horizon of economics. Critical thinking, which is a cornerstone of the Rethinking Economics movement, alongside real world thinking. We want to think about real world application of economics, policy proposals, and we want to critically analyze those together so that we don't think there is one right answer, but collectively we need to decide on the route to go forward. The 3 Ds of economics, so diversity, decolonizing and democratizing economics. We are a democratic organization, and we had a democratic body of students and academics to develop this festival. This will be a very diverse festival. We have speakers from around the global south and across the discipline, and decolonizing economics. We want to bring that frame into our analysis and our economics. Accessibility and internationalism. So we've tried to, as we said, have a really diverse international speaker list, and we're going to talk about lots of different topics from around the world, as well as we've got closed captioning on YouTube. Some of our sessions will be Spanish, and we'll be working towards translating some of these sessions after the event. Yes, and that's about it for the principles, but what we really wanted to talk about is we wanted to look at some of the problems in society, whether that be the pandemic, climate change, rising inequality, or racism. And this year we wanted to talk about change. How do we change economics? How do we change the curriculum? What are those changes that we need to think about? To help us think about those changes, we developed 5 themes: social economics of climate change, hidden and forgotten and informal economies, which will be about thinking about what are the economies which aren't necessarily recognized, informal economies, feminist economics. We've got some great speakers with that. Global South economics, which will focus on South-to-South relationships, as well as looking at some of the interesting ideas coming out of the Global South, as well as digital economy, which is very present within our lives, as this presentation is proving, and COVID-19, the political and economic impacts of COVID-19. And within those themes, we're trying to answer the following question: what do our economic futures look like? To help us answer that question, we have Jayati Ghosh, a development economist who was a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University for 35 years, who is now at Massachusetts Amherst. She was named as a United Nations high-level advisor on economics and social policy. She has advised governments, she's a recipient of many awards, and authored just about to be 20 books, one of which was Never Done and Poorly Paid, Women's Work in Globalizing India. She's also the Exec Secretary at the International Development Economy Associates. Jayati Ghosh, would you please join us on stage to help us answer some of the questions of the festival?
Well, thank you so much. Very excessive introduction, actually. I'm really honored and I'm delighted to be here because I really think rethinking economics is one of the reasons why I am at all optimistic about the future. The very fact that a group of you, mostly young people, got together and did so much so quickly, because you've really been quite remarkable in how much you've managed to achieve, I think, just in the few years that you've been around, and that you still have such a forward-looking and exciting agenda. I feel very privileged to be part of your journey. I'm really happy that you called me, so thank you. And with that, I'm not going to say anything very profound, I don't think, or anything that you probably don't know already. But let me try and put down what I think some of the last year has taught us, particularly about not just the state of economics, but what we need to do and what kind of economic future we can anticipate if things change and if things don't change, both. I'm not going to repeat too much of what we knew was wrong with economics. You all know that much better than me, really, that it was fundamentally static in orientation, with unrealistic assumptions, with an obsession with techniques rather than analysis that would realistically portray an economy, the kinds of policy straitjackets that it created, the lack of diversity. These are all the challenges that you've already recognized, and these are the things that you are working to move out of. So there's no point in belaboring those. But then what did the last year and a half show us? It showed us that some of the other things which perhaps we hadn't put front and center so much really, really matter. And that we have to now address those very systematically, both conceptually and empirically, and to figure out ways to deal with these in policy terms. So the first is the notion of externalities. I mean, we use them a lot, right? I use them myself. I keep saying there are these externalities, and that's why these markets don't function this way, and so on and so forth. We have to stop thinking of them as external. They are not external to the economic system, nor are they external to the ways in which the markets function. They are often created by the markets. Shocks that we think of as external are not external in the same way. The pandemic is seen very much as one of these, the finance minister in India called it an act of God. Okay, that's how external it is seen as. But the very fact that this pandemic could play out the way it has is the result of the ways we have structured our economies, the ways we have hollowed out public health systems, the ways in which we have enabled the commercialization and privatization of the ways in which we have at the same time enabled forms of global mobility, which means that you cannot control the spread of disease in the ways in which earlier times or more authoritarian regimes could have done. But similarly, we have seen in the last couple of months in particular, extreme weather events in places that were not supposed to have the extreme weather events, if you see what I mean. In other words, it was really quite common to think that, yes, climate change is happening, climate change is coming soon, climate change is almost upon us, not realizing that we are already in it. Maybe we're not in the vortex of it, but we are already in that climate crisis. It's no longer something in the future. And it was also assumed that, the climate crisis is first going to hit certain parts of the world, which are more likely to be affected, particularly around the tropical, subtropical areas, which are more prone to sea rise impacts and so on and so forth. Now we know that that's not true, that it's much worse than that. That not only are we already in the midst of that climate change, but it's operating in all kinds of ways that are unexpected. We now know that the Arctic is melting 5 times faster than was predicted by the most pessimistic IPCC prediction, and that the Gulf Stream has changed. And that changes everything. That really means we cannot anymore say, well, this is going to happen if you do 1.5% change in temperature, and that will happen if you have 2%. Frankly, all of these changes are now already happening before we hit peak anything. So you're getting major climate changes in the Northern Hemisphere, in Asia, in North America, and you're getting major climate change impacts across the developing world, particularly around the equatorial and subtropical regions. Now, all of this means that you can't think of economies in isolation of these huge impacts. The pandemic has also brought out the massive disparities and polarization that exist, so that we find that economics of policy have changed dramatically in some countries, in the advanced economies, in the United States especially, but even in Europe, which was so hesitant about fiscal spending in the past, there's definitely been a significant change. That's not true in the developing world. In most of the developing world, there's still a great deal of fiscal paranoia, is really the only way to put it. And some of that is justified only because they are rightfully scared of the response of capital markets. In other words, governments are afraid to spend their way out of this crisis because they're worried that once the fiscal deficit to GDP ratios go up, which they inevitably will, then you will have capital flight. You'll have a credit rating downgrade. You'll have a harder and harder time getting sovereign debt. And all of this has really meant that we've had not just a divergence, an obscene divergence in terms of vaccine production and distribution, but we have also a massive diversion, distinction in terms of fiscal response. So the advanced economies are spending anywhere additionally, or anywhere between 5 to 25% of GDP in the COVID crisis. Developing countries as a whole are spending less than 5%. The emerging economies as a group between 4 and 6%. The low-income countries 2%, 3%. I mean, nothing, really nothing, and certainly nowhere near what is required in terms of even just straightforward recovery. But as I mentioned, we're no longer in that world where straightforward recovery from the past will suffice, because we are now going to be in a period of continuing crises. You can perhaps eventually, after a couple of years, bring this particular COVID-19 pandemic under control if we can distribute enough vaccines and so on, and if we don't get major mutant varieties that threaten the vaccines. But we may get new pandemics. We will definitely get other new forms of zoonotic disease. And we have simultaneously these impacts of climate change. These are all known unknowns, if you like. We know these are coming, all of these. And then there are the unknown ones that we haven't even thought about predicting yet. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, that a lot of the economics that we do, even the heterodox economics that we do, is too confined to earlier models, stress testing those models. And that doesn't work, or it is unlikely to work in the medium-term future. So we really have to think of new ways of confronting these challenges. And it's not impossible, but it does mean that we have to change our own visions. And of course, we have to reject what we know is wrong in a lot of mainstream economics, which is too rigid, too stultified, too unrealistic to be able to address any of these problems. But we also have to address them in our own thinking, because we also have not fully absorbed how much things are changing and what huge impact that change will have in different ways. So we need new parameters to assess, to analyze the impact of shocks, so-called, to identify shocks that are brewing, the way that they will play out, the way that they are transmitted, across different categories, sectors of the economy, different geographies, different types of people, according to identities and so on. And the ways in which we can both cope with these and push back against further such shocks and tendencies. This really does require stepping out of our own theoretical and, I mean, the boxes we're comfortable with. Okay, let me confess, let me admit myself, I'm comfortable with a broadly Marxian stroke Keynesian stroke Kaleskian framework. But a lot of these things are not necessarily accommodated in that. So we have to really be thinking almost from a clean slate in terms of figuring out how to deal with contemporary challenges, because they are unlike the challenges of the past. They're coming together, they're coming in different ways and from directions that we don't anticipate. And they're operating in a global economy that is hugely unequal and has got even more polarized than before. So we therefore need to use new conceptual tools, but then we also have to bring in, I believe, areas of research which we have talked about and which your own festivals in the past and the current festival are going to be talking about. But we need to develop and delve into these much more deeply. The issue of livelihood in particular is something that has come out so starkly in this pandemic. It's not just a question of, is everybody employed and what is the kind of employment they have and the conditions of employment. It is that are people enabled to live a decent life? Are they earning enough livelihood to live a decent life? Then, of course, there are all the issues around employment and what constitutes employment. I'm so delighted that you're doing this session on informal and hidden economies, because so much of work is not classified as employment. And so much of it in work that is not necessarily socially desirable. I could think of finance, for example, or some types of marketing. If you're marketing opioids, maybe that's not the kind of employment you want to generate more of, for example. Essentially, we need to think more about the quality of life that we want in our societies and across the world. And then how do we generate the economies that will give us that quality of life? So I am, for example, at the moment in a council set up by the World Health Organization. It's called the Council for the Economics of Health for All. And that's the vision. Okay, we want health for all. Now, what is the economic arrangement? What are the policies? What are the strategies that we need to get to health for all? We could think of that similarly for the entire range of human capabilities. What do we need to ensure education for all, housing for all, a decent work for all? What do we need to ensure that people are allowed to unleash their creativity in different ways? What do we need to ensure that people get appropriate care at every part of their life cycle? So we need to then think of the economy we need that will give us those things. And then we have to think about what is it that is stopping that economy from happening, and how do we sustain such an economy over time? Now, that in turn means completely rethinking all the buzzwords that we were told are the answer. Okay, public-private partnerships is a classic example. We're told that we have to think of ways of incentivizing the private sector, and that public sector's job is really to incentivize the private sector to do the things that it can do well, and in terms of even providing all of that. We're even told that that's the way to do climate finance, that we have to do PPPs to do climate finance with innovative financing mechanisms, which are really ways by which governments or people, taxpayers, subsidize the risk and enable the private agents to make profits. But we find that those have not worked so far, and they are not going to work. They didn't work so far in even mitigating, forget about adapting to climate change, and they certainly didn't work during the pandemic. So we have to rethink this whole model, and we have to think of ways in which we can achieve the outcomes we want in terms of change with a different combination of things, relationship between public and private. which includes public investment, which includes different kinds of regulation, which changes incentives. And it's not just about providing positive incentives, but it's also about ensuring that you have disincentives for bad behavior, if you like. Monitoring, different kinds of taxation. All of these are things that we have to think about now much more solidly and immediately, because these are challenges going away. They're going to get worse and larger. So we have to really be thinking about these in great detail right now. And of course, it does mean that we have to have much greater accountability of states when we do this. It's fine to say public-private as if public is the agent of the people. But we know that in far too much of the world, they are not. In far too much of the world, they have been captured by private interests, private corporate interests. And there are many states which are often actively working against their own people. And all of this has been made much more advanced by digital technologies, which we are beneficiaries of, for sure, right? I mean, we are able to talk together on this interesting new platform, Remo, because of the whole digital revolution. But at the same time, we know that this digital technology has enabled surveillance of a kind that was unthinkable even a few years ago. There's a big scandal right now with the revelations around the Pegasus software, which in India has been used by the Indian state very openly. Well, they haven't officially admitted it, but it's obviously been used by the Indian state against some of its best citizens, against some of the human rights defenders, lawyers, academics, and others who have been really doing their best for the country. And we find that this technology is being used by states everywhere else for extensive monitoring and surveillance. So if we're not careful, we can sleepwalk into a situation of complete control by the state. Whereas what we want is a state that is accountable and democratic. So there are many of these challenges. And of course, all of this democratic state, etc., also then requires global arrangements that enable that to happen. And that too, it's not something so easy. It's not something that you can automatically get, but you have to have enough of political demand for it that individual states also cannot hold out against it, that there will be such a demand that the global arrangements will also have to change. Now, this is a big ask, but I'm actually feeling more confident about asking it because I really find, especially with the younger generation and people like all of you involved in rethinking economics, that there is a sense of confidence and solidarity, which is absolutely essential, but which perhaps we didn't have to the same degree. And I think that this combination of confidence and solidarity and the ability to do the work, right? You have to sit there and do that research. You have to sit and think these things through and do the hard work of whatever empirical analysis and everything to actually get to new results. But all of this combined with creativity, which again, I think you're showing quite a lot of, we can actually do that. We can change the economics discipline, but we can also change the economic future that we are facing, which, let's face it, otherwise it's quite bleak. It's really very depressing, but it can be changed. It's not written in stone. And finally, I think there is an urgency to all this, which is perhaps not realized even by us. You know, we say we have to change, and then when people tell us, yes, we will consider this, when, I don't know, university administration say we will put it to a committee and then that committee will sit on it for 5 years. When tax reform committees of the OECD and others say, yes, consider this over the next 2 years. When the WTO says we will consider something about intellectual property over the next 6 months, we let them do that. We don't say it's too urgent. You have to do something now about the control of monopoly of knowledge on vaccines, because otherwise every day hundreds of people are dying unnecessarily. We don't do that enough. So I think along with all the other attributes you've already shown in rethinking economics, you have to add urgency to this and really, join together and push for significant changes. I think it's possible. I mean, honestly, interacting with your kinds of groups really does give me hope. It's not that the challenges aren't huge, but they can be overcome. And I think this is a really good way, this festival is a really good way to get going on all of this. So let me stop here. I know there will be lots of questions and comments and discussions, so I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you, Jayati. That was, yeah, immensely inspiring. I have a question, and then we can go to the questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A on the right-hand panel. You can also put comments in the chat, but they might not be picked up. If you put down anonymous when you put down a question as well, we won't invite you to speak. But if you don't, then we'll invite you to speak and say your question on stage. So you talked, Jayati, a lot about so the positives in the sort of movements, the like young people, the sort of changes that have happened like culturally in a younger generation. Do you feel, or have you seen like changes within economics, education, academia already? Like how does this moment compare to, say, like 10, 15 years ago, when maybe the movements were like smaller, or the voices were quieter, but whereas now we've had a sustained period of calls for change. I'm just curious if you feel that changes have been made, or we still got quite far to go. You're on mute.
That's a really good question. You know, I think it's both. We certainly still have a long way to go. There's no doubt about that, right? Oh, I have to turn up my microphone. Sorry, let me just figure out how I do that.
I can hear you okay.
Oh, okay. So let me just talk louder. And for some reason, the light seems to have got very dim. But anyway, yeah, so we have a long way to go, for sure. No doubt about it. But we also have to recognize that, okay, I have lost count of the times. I've been around for, 40 years as a professional economist. Until a decade ago, I was usually pretty much the only woman, and the only woman from a developing country. I mean, the only person from a developing country. So I was useful. I would tick off 2 boxes. Right? I'm delighted to say that's no longer the case. That you will get lots of people from different ethnic backgrounds. You will get many more women. Not enough, for sure. It's still lots of mammals around, but many more. People from different perspectives as well. I think that's a very big one. Remember, economics has been very, it's really put up barriers against people with different perspectives. That was another big thing. And that's still a lot, but it's opening up a little bit more than it has in the past. So yes, I think there has been progress. It's certainly not enough. What I do also appreciate, though, is that a lot of my younger colleagues and students and all, they say, no, of course that's not enough. I mean, why are you so happy with so little? I love that. I love the fact that they're not willing to settle for less. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Just going to some of the questions in the chat. Afreen, I don't know if you want to ask your question in person. I think you should have the ability to turn your video and mic on.
Yes, there he is. Hi, Afreen.
Dr. Ghosh.
Oh, you're very quiet, Afreen.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Maybe speak loudly.
Yeah.
Is this better?
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you for your amazing talk. I'm Afreen. I'm a PhD candidate at JNU, your former university. My
Don't be former. My heart is here.
Yeah. Good to hear. Good to hear.
Yeah.
So my question was, is this globalized production cycle an impediment to sustainable futures, economic and otherwise, essentially human futures, right? Or do we need a reversion to a form of localized production and governance models? Thank you.
Very good question, Afreen. I would say that there are some aspects of the globalized production which are completely unsustainable, particularly, for example, food. Okay, I think our global food system is disastrous. It's carbon intensive, it's wasteful, it's wrong, and it's unhealthy as well. Now we know it's also deeply unhealthy. So definitely in the area of food, we should move to much more localized, much more seasonal, much more natural, much less meat intensive, all of those things. With a range of other things, I would say it's more complicated. Unfortunately, we see a lot of globalized production through the lens of the global value chain that is driven by a multinational company. But that need not be the only form of globalized production. And the multinational value chains that were established were designed to find the cheapest location for every process in the production or, in final assembly. But you can think of these as also ways to maximize efficiency gains in other ways. So let's face it, there are some things that enabled it. It wasn't so much globalization per se as container technology that really made transport so much cheaper. And that's not a bad thing, that's good. It's good to be able to have very cheap transport between countries. We should be able to redirect that in ways that ensure that value is retained wherever even part of the process is made. The problem with the globalized system is that in that value chain, all the profits and the value, the pre-production and post-production phases. Let's say Apple, right? I mean, the whole thing is made in China and Hong Kong and so on, but the 90% of the profits go to, at the moment, Ireland and the Cayman Islands. But basically it's the North that captures it because they control design and all of that, and they control the marketing. So those are the things we have to address. And we can. There are regulatory processes that can force those companies to change track if we have the political will to push those regulatory processes. So I would say it's not the internationalization of production per se, but it's the fact of control by companies that are doing it only in their own profit-oriented interests, rather than in the broader social interest.
Brilliant. It answers that perfectly. Just to go to one of the anonymized questions, due to the severity and dimensions of the climate crisis, do you think biophysical economics, thermoeconomics must play a central role in current economics curriculum and research?
Okay, now this is a very tough question for me since I don't actually know enough about biophysical and thermoeconomics. The closest I have ever come to this is Georgescu Rogan and his book on entropy in the economic process, right? But there is no doubt that we have been living in a peculiar and unrealistic silo as economists, in which we have ignored natural processes. We have seen everything as raw material to play with infinite supplies and with very low consequences. I mean, we factor in a bit of pollution, but really that's it. And all that has to change. There's no doubt about it. What one calls it, I mean, I'm sure what you mentioned has huge insights. I am not myself sufficiently qualified to answer, but definitely we have to broaden. And it's not just that we must do that subject. We must be working with natural scientists. We must be working with, evolutionary biologists. We should be working with psychologists and social anthropologists. We should stop thinking of economics as this know-it-all, annoying discipline that has got it better than others, which, let's face it, was very much the mindset of a lot of people whom I interacted with in the economics discipline over these decades. So yeah, we have to broaden out. We have to be willing to learn more. We have to be willing to read everything and anything that pertains to our object of research and not ask, is it part of this discipline or that discipline? So we have to broaden out and become once again a worldly philosophy, really, looking at the world and philosophizing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the cornerstones of rethinking economics to be interdisciplinary and to really broaden our horizons, and we're trying to work out how to move forward as a society. Yeah, really good question. This was an anonymized question, but I think I saw somebody originally asked it otherwise. I'm going to assume that they don't want to ask this in person. How do we resist the increasing dominance of digitalization and private finance?
Oh, wow, that is such a good question, because I wish I knew how, but you're right, that it's a huge challenge. Now, here's the difficulty. It's going at such a rapid rate, and we're all so dependent on it, and everyone is becoming more and more dependent on it, that it is really one of those processes. It's like rolling downhill. It has a momentum of its own. So yes, it's going to be hard to stop. Now, one hypothetical counter to this is to have state-led digital finance. Okay, the Chinese are doing that. They're doing a digital currency, and of course, people like Katerina Pistor, whom I respect greatly, have been arguing that central banks should be getting into it rather than allowing private companies to control. But here's the problem: can we trust the states to, behave themselves with this as well? Because, this reminds me, Kindleberger had a wonderful phrase, money is power and international money is international power. But in the case of digital finance, this is even more true, because unlike conventional money, the enabler of that currency will now know everything about you, will have a 360-degree knowledge of your life. And whether we can entrust states with that, in fact, it's not a question of whether, I know we cannot. Okay, I come from a country where the state is surveying its citizens, right? Is basically snooping on all of us. So we cannot rely on the states to do this. So we need ways to curb and control this. Now, this, I believe, is one of the critical areas of research, which brings in another part that I should have mentioned earlier when I said other disciplines. One of the things, again, we economists ignored for too long is law. Okay, whereas, again, as Katerina Pistor's work has shown, so much of the economy that we are dealing in today is living off the legal codes that are created not even in legislatures, but in Wall Street and in the City of London. Okay, but the digital one is actually, it's out of the park, because it's happening on its own without adequate legal mechanisms to deal with it. This is a huge and critical, important area of research for economists. How do we manage digital finance? What are the legal codes? What are the regulatory practices? What are the enforcement mechanisms to make sure that we protect people from the predatory activities of capital and the surveillance activities of the state? It's a huge area. I don't have an answer, but this is definitely something that must be a critical research question for all of us.
Great, thank you. Yao, do you want to ask your question? I don't know if Tech can give Yao the ability to do that, if he doesn't already have it.
Yes, hello. Hi.
For this very interesting talk, and it just made me think a little bit on the boundaries and the borders that we have within our science, not even mainstream, but also heterodox economics. So I would like to know whether, as critical economists, drawing from a different understanding of how the economy works and inequalities and poverties are reproduced, should we implement racial and gender sensitive models to analyze this shared future that we are trying to understand here in this festival, or should we give up modeling overall? I would like to, I know these are two extremes, but from my understanding, modeling has very difficult consequences, and to the extent that we have to define which are the external variables. And as you have mentioned, the pandemic cannot be classified entirely as an external one. So I'd like to have your comments on that. Thanks.
Wow, this is such a difficult. Well, look, I don't think we should give up modeling overall. I mean, it's a really good question and a very thoughtful question. But I'm a believer in 100 flowers blooming. Okay, where I have a problem with modeling is where it says, well, we've got the answer because we put it through our CGE model or our SAM or our something, and so we've got the answer. That's where I have a problem. But I think the models can give you interesting results within the limitations. Once you say, well, look, these are the assumptions we've made. These are the things that we have taken on board, and these are the things we could not take on board. And this is one of the ways in which this mechanism plays out. That, I think it's hugely useful. So I would not discount that at all. It's not, this issue of when something becomes, race sensitive, gender sensitive, etc. It's such a complicated issue, and I can see you're a sensitive type, so I can put it to you like this. Just naming it some way doesn't help. I've seen this so often in feminist modeling. You have women workers and men workers, and therefore it's gender sensitive. Because so that's not true, because there are so many different ways in which the woman can or cannot enter the labor market. That it's, just what I'm trying to say is that bringing in differences is a very complicated issue. And some of it is amenable to modeling, some of it is not. Is aware of what is amenable. Says, okay, well, I find this to be the most central point and I will highlight that. Then it can do a lot of very interesting and important results. And a lot of econometric stuff, the things done by Raj Chetty, for example, in the US, which is done in a fairly mainstream way. But what he does is to identify how life chances change depending on where you're born, who you're born to, whether you're born a girl or a boy, all of these things change dramatically. So what he's doing is providing you empirical estimations of what happens just when you isolate that. Okay, so yes, I do believe modeling has a role to play. Having said that, let me, even though you didn't ask the question, but I'm going to say that one of the ways in which I think the modeling has been a bit unfortunate, in fact, I would even say disastrous, is in RCTs, in randomized control trials, where you isolate a particular thing and you claim that you are really, you've got a control group that is identical in every respect, and that you get a result, and then you can apply that result to other contexts, other societies, even the same people over a different time period. I think that's false. I think that contradicts really what we are, which is a social study. I hesitate to even call it a science. And we know that societies are constantly changing and affected by different norms. So I think RCTs that claim to get anything resembling a result that is broadly applicable from a single RCT, I think those are fundamentally scientifically flawed. But other than that, yes, modeling. So long as, the modeler is modest, recognizes what they're doing and not doing.
Professor.
Great. Priya, would you be up for asking your next question? If somebody could give her the ability.
Hi.
Hi, Priya.
Hi, it's such an honor to hear you today. Every time you speak, I think so many of us in the profession are filled with inspiration, and thank you. I wanted to ask from my perspective, having worked in international development for a number of years now, and really facing the kind of struggle of what you say of like the contemporary dynamics being so different to kind of the tools that theory has given us, and finding a lot of kind of hope and re-envisioning within the reparations and restorative justice models. And I wanted to ask you really what your thoughts are on, do we need do we need a kind of, policy revolution moment in a way to find solidarity with those looking for repair, re-envisioning of economic models, and I guess reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism? Because, a lot of the analysis does support that race and poverty are correlated, and that the inequality that we see today isn't by accident. It's still a legacy that's hardwired into the current model. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
These are such thoughtful questions. Yes, Priya, you're right. We know, right, that there's this whole legacy of not just colonialism, but even pre-colonial. I mean, there's this very, very strong inequality embedded in all of our current economic relations. And of course, then that gets expressed in everything, in finance, in medicine, you name it, it's all over, in every aspect of our lives. Will the reparations, so here's my view on the reparations. I have to admit, I have evolved over this, okay? There was a point where I would have said, let's focus on change now rather than getting into the past. That would have been what I would have told you maybe 15 years ago. But I now see that recognizing the past and forcing some change because of it is necessary for even the current changes. In other words, that you're not going to get a real transformation. Mind you, that very process of reparation also then generates pushback, right? I mean, then you get the Trumpians and you get all kinds of other neo-fascistic responses everywhere, because everywhere the empire strikes back also, right? But okay, let me confess to two changes in my own approach, and maybe if that's helpful at all or not, I don't know. One is I used to object to purely what I felt were purely symbolic measures, okay, which I felt don't really mean anything. There is a big thing now in US campuses and meetings and academic work where you begin by stating that you are presently on the land of the, Nanotuck tribe or whatever it is. And I used to feel, let me be honest, I used to be a little irritated by this. I said, what is this? It's not like they're giving this land back. Why are they all pretending that they care about this? And it was pointed out to me by others that, actually over time, the more you keep repeating this, the more you stress this, the more you recognize this, it can in fact force change. And this is happening in, currently, as you mentioned, I'm based in UMass Amherst. There is a suburb of Northampton where they were going to build a flyover and a new department store or something around some land, which was of course part of the land grant given to the university. And widespread protest has stopped that from happening. And there is now talk of reinstating that land, which frankly would have been unthinkable, okay? So in a way, even the symbolism over time makes a difference. I was wrong to say this is purely symbolic. Symbolism also matters. Similarly, the demand for reparations sounds completely unrealistic today because nobody's going to bother with it. But if you keep at it, and if you keep pointing out how that is playing into current inequalities, including for carbon emissions, including for everything else, perhaps, yes, it will make a change. Final point on your thing about do we need a revolution in the way we do economic policy? Oh, absolutely we need it. We definitely need it. The only thing is, the third thing that has changed in me is my vision of how revolutions happen, which is, it's not one big bloody moment and blah, and cataclysm, and then we all wake up and it's a new world. No, it doesn't happen that way. It happens through everybody chipping away at little things and quietly building on the side. So yeah, I think yes to what you said. Yes.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the guidance.
Yeah, really brilliant point to add that point as well. Just that chipping away is what we need to do. That's what we always talk about within Rethinking Economics, is that like together, group by group, person by person, we need to change people's minds and work towards, chipping away at that big problem. Great, so we've got probably time for this last question. Should we emphasize the difference between globalization, brackets bad, and internationalization, brackets good, much more? So should we emphasize the difference between globalization and internationalization much more?
Yeah, that's what we always said, right? I mean, look, generation that grew up reading Proletarians of the World Unite. Right? So we began with internationalization. That was our thing. We were internationalists. And then suddenly that got taken away with us, like so much else. I mean, adjustment was structured leftward. Will you believe it? It was talking about how you have to change the sectoral relationships and so on, until guess who, Bretton Woods institutions came and took it over. So yes, we got swept away by the tide of corporate-driven globalization. And the response to that in many cases has been extreme, often ethno-nationalism, and the worst kind of very revanchist tendencies, which do not help us, okay? So yes, we definitely must pose an internationalism to this aggressive globalization. Having said that, there's another complexity, and that has to do with the fact that, you know, in all of this, just chipping away, we need coalitions. We can't, we're great and we love each other, but we're not big enough. We are not important enough. We are not powerful enough. So we have to have coalitions. And a lot of the people whom we will have to have coalitions with are not people we would agree with on everything else. That's very hard to stomach. It's not always ideal. But you will have to build coalitions, and that also recognizes that ultimately, whether we like it or not, the nation state is where a lot of these things play out. You know, we are citizens of a state. We can hold our state to account, or try to, or be arrested by our state, or whatever. But the point is that the nation state is still the venue for a lot of these interactions. So we cannot ignore that nation state. And we can't say we are only internationalist. The other aspect of internationalism is that a lot of people within countries identify internationalism as the privilege of the elite. And it's true, right? All of us who are attending this today, we are the elite in our own countries. I mean, how many people can get onto a laptop and do Zoom or do Remo or any of these things? So we have to recognize that internationalism is a luxury also. I mean, it's necessary, but it's a luxury. So we have to be a little bit more sensitive to those who feel nationalist, or who are not in the business of worrying about internationalism, if you see what I mean. Yes, express solidarity. Yes, participate in international. I mean, I personally am truly and deeply internationalist, but I see that as a luxury and a privilege. And I recognize that a lot of the fights have to be national, or even, you know, lower, provincial or local, they have to be. And in those fights, you will have to bring on board many people who are not international in their outlook. But you need them, you know, and they need you, in fact. We have to do all of that together. So I would say, yes, we should posit it, but we should also recognize that it has a particular place.
Really, really, really profound point there. Something that we grapple with a lot, the sort of local versus international versus national. Yeah, it's something that we're still talking about. Yeah. So I think we probably need to finish with the questions, but it would be great if Jayati, you could help summarize some of the things that have been said so far. Maybe a helpful question to frame that would be, and this has actually been asked in the chat, is like, what should we do now? What should we do as rethinkers, as citizens, as people? How should we take this knowledge forward?
Wow. You know, I get the feeling you don't need any advice from me. You people have really been very creative and very thoughtful in the way you put together events and then the things that you're doing. I would just say, keep doing what you're doing, do more of it, do more research together, think of collaborative projects across countries. I mean, international is great for that, certainly. Use your capacity to benefit from the techniques of these platforms. Don't be afraid of using technical stuff as much as possible. In fact, definitely, yes, use it, but don't let that rule you, which is what tends to happen with a lot of students, that you end up doing what can be done with that technique rather than with the ultimate analysis. Be confident. Be as confident as you have been and more, because I think, I've been on the wrong side of history for a very long time, but I have history is changing, and it's changing much more rapidly than we anticipated. And also change comes from directions that we don't always see. But when change comes, we should be ready, prepared, flexible. And the groundwork that you're doing is all part of being that. So what should you do? Keep doing what you're doing with that confidence and solidarity. Pick on research that you know is difficult, that we don't have answers, that none of your supervisors can help you with, because those are the questions that are going to matter in the future.
Amazing. So we're just about out of time. Jayati, where can people keep up to date with your research, your work, get in contact if need be?
Sure. So I have, my email is jayatijnu@gmail.com. Please feel free to write to me. Shall I put it down in the chat? Will that help?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, and you can share it as well. And I have a lot of my stuff is available on the Network Ideas website. It's www.networkideas.org. Oh, I think I've typed it in wrong.
I can type it in.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay. And also on the Perry website, which is the Political Economy Research Institute at Amherst. So let me see, perry.umass.edu. Okay, so I've just put it into the, oh dear, I put it in the Q&A. Sorry, not very intelligent.
We'll copy it and put it
Yeah, if you can pull that out, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be happy to interact online and in any other way that we can. Yeah.
Brilliant. Great. Okay, so for everybody on Remo, we're going to be closing the session in about a minute. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Jayati, for your really inspiring and profound words.
Thank you for this. I really enjoy it, and I'm so delighted to be part of what you're doing. I think it's fantastic.
Brilliant. And for those of you who want to stick around, there are sessions at 1 p.m. UTC +1. Go to the website to find times nearest you. The next sessions will be on impacts of growth economics on natural resources in the local communities, and BRICS and South-South relationships. The session 1, impacts of growth, will be in the social economics of climate change building, and the BRICS and South-South economics relationships will be in the Global South economics building. But please do feel free to stick around, sit on a table, turn your mic on, turn your video on, and chat to people about some of these questions. Some of these questions were unanswered, so please do feel free to discuss them with people at the festival. Thank you again.
Thanks. Sorry I didn't answer all the questions, but do get in touch.